Hey everybody, this is my 55-gallon Gourami tank with its new and improved lighting. I'm really enjoying the new LEDs I put on here today. It looks really good. The reason we're going to have a look at this tank for a few minutes is just to enjoy the new fish that are in there. I put that new angelfish you can see there on the left, and I put a bunch of new neons in here which also look really good under that new light. I'm just really happy with the new LED that's in there. But I recently shot a video where I talked about quarantining our fish and when we should and whether that's always practical. And it wound up being a little rushed. As I started filming, I went into it ill-prepared and my camera battery started running low. And when it started out saying 14 minutes, and before you know it, within a minute or two, it was down to 10. And so I was really having to step up the pace of what I was trying to say and get my thoughts out there as quick as I could before the battery died. And I wound up not really covering all of the points that I wanted to make. And a few of the things I wanted to talk about were the practicality of your everyday fish keeper to maintain a quarantine tank and to keep it up and running, or to simply set up and establish a quarantine tank at the drop of a hat when they need one, just because they decided to bring home a couple of new guppies today. So either way you do that, whether you keep one up and running or you slap one together the day you bring a fish home, you have to have a really good understanding of the nitrogen cycle in order to do that. If you're going to throw a tank together spur of the moment, it's an uncycled tank, and you now have to keep fish in an uncycled tank, and you have to understand all the ins and outs of how to do that properly. If you're going to keep a tank up and running, it doesn't have any fish in it, so you're going to have to understand enough about what's going on with that nitrogen cycle to maintain a proper amount of ammonia to keep the bacterial colonies alive. You're still going to have to do water changes on it from time to time. And again, is this something that most people are really going to want to do if they bring home a skirt tetra once a year or something like that? And I would say no, it's really not. You also have to consider what tank you're bringing it home to. You have to consider your sources. I talked about all that stuff in the other video. I touched on most of the basics of, understanding where your fish are coming from, being able to look at them. Some of the things I only skimmed over but wanted to touch on a little more was the idea of risk versus consequences. I knew somebody was going to mention it, and I'm glad they did. In the comment section under the other video, they mentioned that, even though I spoke about ick a lot, they had brought home something or other in one of their fish, and they didn't know about it, and a couple of weeks went by, and it wound up wiping out their whole tank. And I have heard horror stories like that. However, they are very few and far between, and in my own personal experience, as I said, out of the hundreds and hundreds of fish I've brought home, the only thing I've ever brought home that's been problematic has been ick. And out of the hundreds of fish I've brought home, only 4 times have I ever brought ick home from a fish store. I did bring it home from the wild with some wild caught fish one time. In fact, we can have a look at my native tank. Well, we'll work our way down to it. We can have a look at my T-bar right here because he's gorgeous. So I generally think of ick as being my biggest concern when I'm talking about quarantining fish. It's like I understand that getting struck by lightning is a possibility. It's just not something I really worry about a lot. So bringing home some weird virulent disease that I didn't know about, and then suddenly I've wiped out a whole tank, I just think the odds of that happening are so slim. It's much more likely that I'm going to bring home some kind of parasite, or, well, ick is a parasite, but some other sort of parasite, gill flukes, or, some sort of basic common parasite or ailment is much more likely, and most of those are treatable. And again, with ick, it's basically a nuisance, so you got to pay attention to it. So on the tanks that I now have, fish that I've just brought home, I'll pay much closer attention to them for the next few weeks and make sure I don't see anything unusual, and chances are I probably won't. So it's a risk that I took, but for me it's worth it. And in my case, I do have quarantine tanks that are up and running. I just have other fish that are in them right now. The angelfish in the quarantine, a little 10-gallon quarantine tank I wasn't really comfortable with. And in some cases, I have fish that are jumpers, and my quarantine tanks might not have a hood on it. So it might be safer to simply take the chance on putting the fish, in the tank that's got a hood on it directly. Now, if I had a coral reef tank that took 10 years to grow in, and that's a different story. That's the kind of tank that nothing ever goes in it without going through, 3 months of quarantine, because, that's a different story altogether. This is a native tank. This tank, as much as I wouldn't want to lose a bunch of fish in it, I could have them replaced by the end of next week and have this tank up and running again. A coral reef that took you 10 years to establish can't be slapped back together if you have a oopsie and bring home, and you do get struck by lightning, and it is that one oddball fish that had that one oddball disease that now has stricken your entire tank and all your corals are dying. Again, these are very just different circumstances, and you need to consider all of them. If you've got a fish that doesn't have a lot of value but is extremely sentimental to you, I'd take that into consideration. I'd be much more careful about whether or not you simply add fish or you quarantine them first. But the idea of keeping tanks up and running, quarantine tanks up and running, and keeping biomedia and filtration and all that, I know that sounds easy enough, but it sounds easy enough to someone who's enthusiastic about the hobby and somebody that's interested in learning about all that stuff. A lot of people aren't. A lot of people just want to have a pretty fish tank, and they want to buy the odd fish every now and again. I know tons of people, I hear from tons of people that never bother to check their water. They don't even own a test kit. I have a friend of mine that I'm sure he never checks his water. I'm sure he probably says he does from time to time, but I'd be willing to bet he never checks his water. He does his water changes every week like clockwork, and he does his big water change once a month like clockwork, and he doesn't worry about it. And, provided nothing else happens, there's no power failures or something doesn't go wrong with his tank heater or whatever, he never has issues. He doesn't know what's going on with all the ins and outs of what's going on with that tank, and he doesn't need to. He doesn't keep a quarantine tank up and maintained, and if he did, it probably wouldn't be suitable for the fish if he ever brought them home, because he wouldn't have had it properly maintained by having a tank up and running with no fish in it. So, in a lot of cases, it's simply not practical for people to have a quarantine tank, and you just have to go into it knowing that you're taking your risks by not quarantining an animal, and then that risk is largely going to be probably ick, and then the more unusual or uncommon the parasite or the ailment or malady is, then the less likely you are to have it. That's kind of just stands to reason. If it's more common, it's, more people experience it. So the chances of that one fish you bought being that one that brought home that weird disease that wiped out your whole tank, it's there, but, having an airplane crash out of the sky while you're driving down the highway, that possibility's there too. I don't really sweat it when I'm driving down the road, and I drive around BWI all the time. So, I don't know if I've got any other thoughts on this. I probably do, but I feel like I'm starting to wander around aimlessly here. I'm getting distracted by all my fish. I really was just kind of in here enjoying the fish, and I thought I would just shoot some video and chat about what was on my mind, and kind of following up with that other video is what was on my mind. So there you go. Make sure you subscribe. That way you never know. You never miss what I get. You never know what it's going to be whenever I do put it out. Like I say, it's hit or miss, spur of the moment, a lot of stuff. So thanks again for watching this one. Don't forget, this is my native tank. See you real soon in the next one.